Welcome, everyone, to this session on Jewish planning for the end of life. I'm glad that you've all come to talk about this together because it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to talk about, and so it's to your merit that you're coming to speak about it today. So, when we talk about planning for the end of our lives, we are first going to talk about how do we prepare ourselves spiritually, because there's more to this than simply practical preparations. And we need to think about how do we prepare our spirits. And there's a wonderful teaching in Pirkei Avot, not the chapter we're studying this week, but this chapter for next week, at the beginning of chapter 3, when it says, Akavya ben Mahalalel liked to say, consider these three things and you will not fall into transgression. In other words, if you want to really live an upright life, what do you have to do? You have to consider three things. First of all, know where you came from. Second, know where you're going. And third, know before whom you will ultimately have to give an accounting of your life. So hopefully we know where we came from, not just physically or biologically, but also we know about our families of origin, our heritage, everything that comes down to us. And when it says know where you are going, the idea is we know where we're all going. There's no way out of here alive, that we're all ultimately going to die. That's the fate of every human being. And the thing that we have to think about is ultimately we have to give an accounting of our lives. Accounting of our lives to ourselves, an accounting of our lives to the one who is more powerful than us, and what kind of life do we want to have lived. And if we can keep in mind both where we come from, where we're going, and the fact that there is a judgment, at least by ourselves, then that might help us to figure out what's the best way to live our lives. And that's part of what this exercise is all about, of contemplating our ends, is to help us live our lives the way we best can. And of course, we do this on Yom Kippur every year. On Yom Kippur, we think about our lives, and we don't emphasize it maybe so much, but we contemplate our deaths. In the clothing that we wear on Yom Kippur, wearing white was a way, the rabbi said, of imitating the angels, and even not eating was a way of imitating holy beings who don't need to eat, but also, of course, those who've left this world don't need to eat. So Yom Kippur really is a rehearsal for our death, and it's intended to bring us to better living, to resolution, to live our lives in a better way, having contemplated the end. And another exercise some people do, and I've heard of this given as a Yom Kippur sermon, is to think about being on an airplane. And you imagine being on the airplane and suddenly the airplane is going down and the airplane is going to crash. And you think through, suddenly you think all the unimportant things in your life fall away. And you think about what is really important. What did you hope to accomplish in your life? What did you hope to say? What relationships did you hope to strengthen? And to imagine that by contemplating that moment, we can actually get some resolution to do those things, to let the least important things fall away. As people often say when they're facing death, that things that seemed important for so long now seem inconsequential. And they really get some focus on what's the most important part of life. And we can do that too, even though we're, thank God, not dying at this moment. But we can think about the end as a way of sharpening our vision of what's the most important for us in this life, and what do we need to do with the time that we have, not knowing, of course, ever when that time might come to an end. So one of the things that might prompt us to do, we hope, is to reconcile with people from whom we're estranged. And it's always hard to find the right moment to do that. What's the right time to suddenly say, I'm going to put aside the resentments or the hurts of years and find a way to reconcile? But we hope that by contemplating death, we can say, our time is short. Our time is so short. And there really isn't time to hold on to grudges. There really isn't time to hold on to hurts. Really, we can let go of those things and reconcile with the people that we're sharing this life with. Also, hopefully, by contemplating the end, we can be motivated to say the things that we need to say. So often, as in the poem, we sometimes read at graveside or at Shiva that says we wait too long. The title alone says it all, that we wait too long to say the things we need to say. We wait too long to say words of love. We wait too long to say words of forgiveness. We wait too long to say words of apology for things we might have done wrong. And we wait too long to say words of wisdom, things we might hope to pass on to those who may be in the world after us. We wait. And so by contemplating our end, we can be motivated to say those things, to make sure those words get said, and to imagine, what if these were the last words? What if this conversation were the last conversation? Would I have felt that I had said all that needed to be said? And of course, as Mary Oliver reminds us in this beautiful poem, The Summer Day, doesn't everything die at last and too soon? It's always too soon. Every death comes too soon, comes when we have not planned for it. And we hope that that knowledge could motivate us to realize that today is the day we could seize our lives and we could use them in the way that we hope they could be used. And we know that so many things stand in our way. So many of the things we've built up over the course of our lives, so many of our own fears, those things stand in the way of our dreams about what our lives could be. But when we contemplate death, that gives us maybe the motivation we need to try to push ourselves towards the vision of what our lives could be before it's too late. Because we only have limited time, and today is the best day to try to understand what we can use the precious time we have to do. And in contemplating death, I think there are three things that can help us feel connected when death feels like a huge disconnect. It feels like the ultimate in disconnection from other people and from the life that we know. And the first one is to understand our connections to all of the earth, to all of creation. The Midrash in Kohelet Rabbah states, in the name of God, see all that I have made, God says, speaking to the first human beings. Everything that I've made it for you. And you are a part of it. So we are a part of all that has been created, a part of all that has ever been and all that ever will be. And as part of the earth, we know that our lives, even though our lives on the earth end, that we have a heritage with the earth that stretches back to the beginning, and that in some ways we merge into the earth at our deaths and are carried with it into its future. So maintaining that understanding that we are a part of all of creation can help us feel less alone when we contemplate the end of our lives. Second thing is to realize that we're part of the human family, part of all humanity. Each day, twice a day, we're taught to say the Shema, the statement that God is one, but also that humanity is one, and that we are connected to each other across all the things that separate us, across the world and across time, through all the humans who have ever lived and all who ever will live. We are part of that family, part of that connection, and the contributions that we make simply by being on the earth, by doing the work that we can in the time that we are here, that contributes to this global project of humanity. That global project that, according to Torah, God started in the very beginning with the hopes that it would lead to goodness, and that we do the best we can in our lives to push towards goodness. That project started long before us and will continue long after us. And we do our part. We are part of that chain, and nothing that we do is lost, even though our lives come to an end. And then lastly, the idea that we are a part of the chain of being that started before us in our families. Our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, great grandparents, stretching back and back and back to the first people, they are all connected to us. We are connected to us as links in a chain, and we are one link. And we are actually the link that connects the past with the future, with all the people who will ever come, people who were perhaps biologically related to, or those whom we've made into our family, those people we've influenced, our friends, our students, people we care for. We've received so much from those who came before us, and we pass so much on to those who will remain in the world after us. And being a link in a chain is different than being alone. Being a link in a chain means that we are part of the past and part of the future in the moments that we have on earth. And when our time comes to end, things will continue without us. And it actually can be a source of comfort for us to know that our end is not the end of everything, but all that we are and all that we have done will be passed on to those who come next. So there's so much more we can talk about preparing ourselves spiritually, but those are just some ideas to start with about things we can think about. And we also have to think about not only preparing ourselves, but preparing those we love and those who love us for our own eventual departure from the world. And the most important thing in terms of preparation is communicating our wishes. That is absolutely the most important thing. We can write documents and we'll talk about documents, and we can make arrangements and we'll talk about arrangements. But speaking to those who are likely to be there when the time comes is absolutely the most important thing, because so often documents are left in drawers and files, and people in the moment have to answer the question, what would this person have wanted? And if they've had that conversation, then they can bring that memory to mind and they can do what you would have wished. And that is the most important thing we can do. So there are planning documents, and at the end, I'll post in the chat a link to this presentation as a PDF that you will have the links to these things because they are linked so that you can access them. And the first one to talk about is advanced directives. And this is a directive that directs medical personnel about what your wishes are for the end of your life. If you have a serious illness, what kinds of treatments do you want? What kind of things do you want not to be done? In what situations do you want to have life support given? In which situations do you want to have it removed? And this document, which again I'll link to, provides us with a way to walk through those decisions and to document them and be able to file them with our loved ones, and also to give them to our doctors so that they are on file and our wishes can be carried out. But again, I want to say the most important thing is that our loved ones know those wishes, because too often those documents can't be found, or even if they can, medical personnel want to rely on what relatives say, what friends say, what those who have maybe a power of attorney say, rather than on the document. So it's the most important thing. Filling out the document is important, but even more important is making sure that others who might be in a position to give information have the right information and are empowered and also comfortable to tell your wishes to the people who need to know them. It's also the issue we're not going to get into in particular of estate planning, but I do have some resources about that, about planning for that. And this is information that comes from Maria Polzetti, who's a member of GJC who works for Community Legal Services. And there are two things here, two documents. One of them is about a program that is in fact for medical professionals in the time of COVID-19, that they are eligible for free estate planning or discounted estate planning. And then there's a document that provides ways for low cost or free estate planning help for certain, income levels of folks. And again, that information will be available on a link. So those are the ways to sort of plan financially. And advanced directives are a way to plan for making sure your wishes about how you want to approach the end of life are carried out. And the other thing I want to say about advanced directives is just that people associate advanced directives with ceasing life support. That's often what they're said to do, to creating a DNR, a do not resuscitate order. But advanced directives are about documenting your wishes. Your wishes may be that in every situation you want everything done. And so you can fill out the advance directive to make sure that that happens. Or you could fill it out to make sure that in some situations, things you don't want done are not done. But you shouldn't feel that advance directives are pushing in any particular directive. They're simply meant to document your wishes, not to make sure that any particular outcome happens. The other kind of document, which has a very long tradition, very long history in Jewish tradition, is the ethical will. So a thousands of years old tradition of writing something that's not about the disposition of property, but is a way of communicating something to the next generation, to those who remain, to the important people in your life, about the things that are most important to you. It's a way of recording your own history and the things that you've learned throughout your life and how you learned them. It's a way to make clear to those who may already know but may need a reminder what was most important to you throughout your life, to pass on the hard-won knowledge that you have gathered throughout your life. And also another way to make sure that everything's been said by writing it down and making sure that it survives you, so that before it's too late, we know that all those things that you had hoped to say had gotten said. And there are many, many examples available that you can find online, but there is this wonderful how-to guide, this book, Ethical Wills and How to Prepare Them, written by Rabbi Jack Reamer. It's a revision of a book he wrote many, many years ago. And it's a beautiful way to, it walks you through the steps of how you can create such a thing. And this is an incredible gift to people who remain behind. It's a source of comfort to be able to really not just remember the words of someone who's no longer on the earth, but to have a document where those words are preserved. It can be really, really meaningful and comforting. So I really want to encourage people to think about doing that. And people often ask, what's the right time to write an ethical will? And the answer is today is a good time. Today is good. And of course, it's something that can be written and then revised and revised constantly whenever you have a chance to do so, just so that you've said those things, you've committed those things to paper. And I'll just share personally that my grandfather didn't exactly write an ethical will, but he did write a sort of story of his life with some accumulated life lessons. And he did this, I think, when he was maybe 50 years old. And I found that in going through my father's things after my father's death. And it was incredibly meaningful for me to see the way that he had phrased these things, incidents I knew about from his life, but the way that he told them and what he gained from them was just incredibly touching to me. So that's something that can remain, and it can remain part of a family history or something that is passed down to the generations, so that not only can we know the names of those who passed from the world, but we really know something about what was most important to them. Then we come to the practicalities of preparation, preparation of the body, funerals, and burials. And we'll go through each of those topics. First is the issue of what happens to the body right after death. So the first thing, and this is important for us to know if we're in this situation with someone else, or to communicate if we want to those who may be in that situation with us, is of course that when someone dies, the tradition is that we say the Shema. And that's, again, where I was talking about the idea of oneness and unity. That's the way of proclaiming God's unity and our unity with the person who has died, even at the moment of their passing, to say that we know that love is stronger than death, and that the bonds that bind us to people who have passed from this world are eternal. And so saying the Shema concretizes that for us, that we are one and connected, even though death has parted us. And then there's also the custom of lighting a candle to represent the soul, and of pouring out water that was in any container. And so those are things that are often done in the room of someone who has died. And the other custom, of course, is that someone stays with the body. The body is not left alone. And so this is the custom of having shomrim, guardians, who stay with the body. And of course, the funeral home has to be contacted. But shomrim are also something one can arrange in advance. One could say, in the event, and if it's possible, I would like there to be shomrim, even I would like the following people to be shomrim. That's something you can indicate. And here's where it is important to have made some sort of arrangement with a funeral home, because a funeral home has to be contacted. Someone has to be called in order to take possession of the body before burial. So it is very helpful to have made an arrangement, even if it's simply to have, maybe you haven't made a contract, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but to know that this particular funeral home is the one you might want to use when the time comes. And then there's this question that often comes up about the body, which is, must burial be immediate? We know that there's a ancient tradition of having quick burial in Judaism, and the tradition from the Talmud is that we can't really start to mourn until burial has been completed, because burial is our obligation to those who die. But we know that in our modern world, where people live far from each other, often burial has to be delayed because there are loved ones who live far away who need to be able to come. And so it is okay for burial to be delayed. And of course, we have the facility, funeral homes have the facility to be able to do that in a safe way and a respectful way. So although there is a preference for funerals to happen quickly, they can be delayed 3, 4, 5 days, sometimes even 6 or 7 days, if it's necessary for close relatives to come in order, because we want to honor the person who has died. And so it's important that those who love them, those who are close to them, be present. In terms of the disposition of the body, usually autopsies, are things that we avoid if we can. In other words, disturbing the body after death is something we avoid. Usually autopsies are not required in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania after death, but sometimes they are. Of course, if there's a case of, God forbid, violent death, but sometimes in a case of an infectious disease. So usually only if it is required is autopsy done, and then we do need to wait until an autopsy is done before the body can then go to the funeral home and be prepared for burial. So that does sometimes delay burial, but it's quite uncommon, I would say. We don't usually end up dealing with it. And certainly if autopsy is a choice, Jewish tradition would err on the side of saying we avoid it, unless it's necessary to save a life. And of course, those are the situations in which sometimes it's required in the state to do an autopsy, is the case where the knowledge gained could save a life. And so, of course, in that case, we are required to do that, because anything that can save a life should be done. Similarly, with organ donation, their organ donation was a question dealt with extensively over the last 50 years in halakha, but the extreme weight of halakha fell on the side of allowing organ donation, even though it does disturb the body. And there is, as you may know, a tradition that all parts of the body should be buried together, but there's an exception made for organ donation, again, because of the possibility of saving or even just improving a life with the organs from someone who has died. That outweighs this custom of making sure the body is buried together. So organ donation is, I think, not only allowed, but should be encouraged. It's an incredible mitzvah to be signed up as an organ donor. because you can give life to people after you're no longer in your body. It's an incredible gift to be able to give to the world after you're gone from it. And there are sometimes cases also when people donate their entire body to science, and that I've dealt with several cases of that in funerals. And what happens in that case is the body is, the possession of the body is taken by the institution to which the body is being donated, and we hold a funeral without the body. And often the body is then eventually returned to the family after important knowledge has been gained. And again, this is something that's allowed by the idea that this could allow knowledge to be gained that would save other lives. And so that is a mitzvah. It's an incredible gift to give. So that is an okay thing to do. And sometimes if the when or if the body is returned, then we would do a burial of whatever condition the body is in at that point. In terms of planning for a funeral, as I've said, it's very helpful to have a funeral home involved because they can take possession of the body and also prepare the body for burial. And we know that there are now 2 Jewish funeral homes through the many mergers, 2 Jewish funeral homes in Philadelphia. Of course, there are many places in the country where there are no Jewish funeral homes, and in those cases, non-Jewish funeral homes usually have the knowledge of what Jewish funeral practices require, and so they will do that for families. And I had experience with that in with my father's death, because in the place in which he died, there was not a Jewish funeral home. But in Philadelphia, where there are Jewish funeral homes, we often use them because they are good people, family-owned places, and they are very experienced with all the needs for a Jewish funeral. And I would say it's quite uncommon for people to use non-Jewish funeral homes for their funerals and burials. But it is certainly possible, and there have been people through GJC who have done that, and the non-Jewish funeral homes are willing to make the accommodations to Jewish funeral practices that are necessary so that it can work. I should say it's uncommon. Funeral homes, of course, are businesses, and they're interested in having people plan in advance and even pay in advance for funeral arrangements. But I'll say that it is actually a really good idea, and actually even a gift that one can give to the people who will be left behind, to actually do the planning in advance and even make the payment in advance if you have the ability to do so, simply because it's both cheaper for them, and then loved ones don't have to go through the pain of planning and paying for a funeral, even if the money is not an issue at the time of death. It's just very, very painful to have to do that at that moment. And then also all the decisions that you might want to make, when we'll talk about those choices, they can all be written down and preserved so that it will happen exactly the way that you want it to happen. And sometimes that can mean actually doing it in a way that is more economical, because in a way that you might feel comfortable making that decision for yourself, and yet your family or friends might not feel comfortable making that decision. They think, well, we should honor them by making a more expensive arrangement. So you might be able to actually, take that off of them by making decisions in advance. The kinds of choices that you need to make when one actually sits down with funeral directors, there are a myriad of choices, but I was trying here to cover some of the most important ones from my point of view. First of all, the location of a funeral service. Funeral services can, of course, be held in funeral chapels, which the funeral homes own. They can also now, and this is a fairly recent change at GJC, they can be held at Germantown Jewish Center in our sanctuary. That used to be something reserved for only past presidents and clergy of the congregation, but the board made a decision over a year ago now that any GJC congregant who wants can choose to have the funeral at Germantown Jewish Center. So that's a choice you can make. And again, it's an important choice to communicate, to write down, to make sure that people know that that's what you would like, if that's what you would like. And of course, funerals can also happen at the graveside. And I would say that the thing I sometimes see is that people make the assumption that if somebody older dies, that a graveside funeral will be the best thing. And it often is actually quite difficult because there are people who cannot come to graveside funerals. Some elderly people or people with mobility issues are not going to be able to come, and who would like to, who would be able to come to a chapel service or a service at the synagogue. So it's just something to consider in making that kind of choice. That while a graveside service can seem very simple, it can exclude people depending on their physical condition. Um, One of the choices that has to be made in planning for a funeral and a burial is a choice of a casket, and Jewish tradition does mandate that caskets be as simple as possible, and does mandate that they be of a disposable material and a biodegradable material like wood, all wood with no metal in them. But there are a large number of options in caskets, as anyone who has seen the variety of caskets can attest. And to realize that the institution of a casket is something relatively recent in Jewish tradition. In Israel, people are still buried simply in funeral shrouds directly into the earth without caskets. Here in the United States, most funeral homes do require a casket. And of course, the most economical casket is the plain pine box. And that is one of the most significant savings one can make in making choices for a funeral, is the choice of casket, because they can run to be thousands of dollars, whereas the plain wooden pine casket is the cheapest and also the most traditional. And something I do urge people to choose. People are often reluctant, again, to do it because they feel like maybe that's not honoring the deceased. But the rabbis were very clear that ostentation in funerals is not a way to honor the deceased. You honor people's lives by speaking about them. You honor people's lives by holding up the mitzvot and the good deeds they did during their lives. The casket is meant to be something simple that is going to help them be returned to the earth. Tahara, the ritual of washing the body and then wrapping it in a linen shroud, is again a choice that can be made. It's a very beautiful ritual, and again, its intent is to emphasize the equality in death, that we are all equal when we leave this world, and so we all wear the same thing in wearing a shroud. And so that is often a additional charge, but I think it is a very important thing to consider, because that way of joining us with everyone who has come before us, I think, is really powerful. And finally, it seems mundane, but one of the choices one has to make is whether transportation is going to be provided for mourners by the funeral home. And again, it's a kind of expense one can save if one simply assumes or decides that people should bring their own cars rather than being transported by the funeral home. So in planning for a burial, um, of course, one needs a place to be buried. Um, and that's a cemetery. And of course, there have been Jewish cemeteries for centuries. And the origin of the idea of having cemeteries that were owned by Jews, where the land was owned by Jews, was a worry that otherwise graves might be disturbed and desecrated if the land wasn't controlled by Jews. And so that's really the origin of the idea that Jews should be buried in Jewish land and Jewish cemeteries. And of course, in Philadelphia, we have a wealth of Jewish cemeteries that have been created over the years. And many synagogues would create their own cemeteries when they were founded. And at Germantown Jewish Center, we chose not to do that when we were founded. But in the early years, GJC acquired plots in a section at King David, and many of the early members of our synagogue who loomed large are buried there, including Rabbi Cherry, Zichrono Livracha. In more recent years, there was a desire among some members to have a closer spot, because King David was a little further away. And some people got together and chose Montefiore Cemetery in Jenkintown. and created a GJC section there. So now in recent years, many of our members have been buried in that section at Montefiore. In fact, I learned from the one of the managers there that that section is pretty much full, and we're in the process of designating a new section for that. And there is so there at Montefiore there is a small discount that you get by being part of that GJC section because they arranged that for us. And the plots at King David are actually owned by the synagogue. So again, if one wants to acquire a plot at King David in that GJC section, there's a small discount that you get because we bought those so many years ago. And of course, some people have family plots that were bought many years ago and went with burial plots reserved for family members. And that was, often when people came from the old country, that was one of the first things that groups from various cities would do is buy burial plots for everyone together. So some people do have that. And that might influence where people choose to buy a burial plot if you want to be, near relatives, near those who came before. One issue that comes up a lot is the idea of can non-Jews be buried in a Jewish cemetery? And maybe it's a little obvious that from the history of Jewish cemeteries that halakhically, non-Jews being buried in a Jewish cemetery is not a problem. Jews being buried in a non-Jewish cemetery is more problematic, but non-Jews being buried with Jews is not really a halachic problem. And yet, some people are concerned about that. So what tends to happen at the cemeteries we have, and different cemeteries have different policies on this, but in general, most parts of cemeteries, most plots, most sections, Jews and non-Jews can be buried together. Sometimes there is a specially designated section in which only Jews can be buried for people who want that. But in most parts of most cemeteries, Jews and non-Jews can be buried together. Of course, some people have burial plots that are far away from here, and they may be in other cities or even in Israel, or people might have the desire to be buried in Israel. And funeral homes can arrange that so that if you have a local funeral home here, you need to have a local funeral home to take possession of the body and prepare the body for burial, maybe even to arrange the funeral. But if the burial is going to be somewhere else, they can arrange either to do the transportation themselves or to arrange to transfer the body to another funeral home that's local to that place that will do the burial there. And they can handle all the paperwork and things like that. They're very experienced at doing that, and as well as for burials in Israel. Some people do choose to be buried in non-Jewish cemeteries for various reasons. And again, the concern there about that Jewish graves might be desecrated if they were in non-Jewish cemeteries is less for us today than it was in centuries past. In terms of halakha, there are several non-Jewish cemeteries that now have Jewish sections, like West Laurel Hill Cemetery has that. But some people want to be buried in a non-Jewish cemetery, and there are ways of creating a little hedge or barrier around the grave to mark it off as a Jewish grave, even within a non-Jewish cemetery. So that is possible if people have a strong desire to do that. One of the reasons people sometimes too desire to do that is the idea of green burial, or a burial that is good for the earth. And the truth is that traditional Jewish burial practices, which reject embalming, which mandate coffins that are simple and that are made entirely of wood, that use a burial shroud that disintegrates very rapidly in the earth, are pretty green. And depending on the cemetery, some cemeteries, and I have to say Montefiore is one of them, do not have the huge expanses of lawn that you sometimes associate with large cemeteries. So that environmental impact is also not that great. So relatively, Jewish burials, traditional Jewish burials, are already relatively light on the earth. It is possible to do burials that are perhaps even more environmentally light on the earth by doing things, and people in our synagogue have done these things, such as using a cardboard coffin, cardboard casket instead of wood, so it'll return to the earth even more quickly and uses fewer resources. And most funeral homes and cemeteries will accept that. And some people do choose to be buried in green sections of non-Jewish cemeteries. And again, accommodations can be made for that if people want to have the halachic requirements for Jewish burial still followed in those cases. Cremation, which is a common burial practice among non-Jews in the United States, has become something people ask about a lot. Of course, the halacha around cremation, the halacha really emphasizes, Jewish law emphasizes honoring the body after death and keeping it intact as much as possible. So cremation is not compatible with that. The tradition determined that the way of honoring the body was to keep it intact and to bury it whole and to return it to the earth slowly in that way. Want to make sure the body is returned to the earth, but not as quickly as cremation would have it. And of course, the Holocaust and the history of Jews being burned, being in crematoriums, that really turned Jews away from cremation. That the impact of that has been very strong. So it's very hard a lot of times to contemplate the idea of cremation when that was done to us against our will as a way of eliminating the Jewish people. Sometimes people are drawn to cremation with the idea that it has less environmental impact than burial. And I'll just say that it really, if you look into it, that is really not the case because cremation actually uses an incredible amount of energy. It releases a lot of toxins. It's really not good for the earth. And the other thing about it, of course, is that people somehow assume that equivalent to burial, that disposes of the body, but in fact it does not, because there are remains that remain after cremation, and something has to happen to those remains. So either they do need to be buried, or in non-Jewish circles, those are often kept in an urn and kept in homes. In Jewish circles, there's a very strong prejudice against that, against having dead bodies with us in our homes. So it's really something to think about, that cremation is not really the end of the story, because there are remains and they have to be dealt with in some way. And finally, I would say there's an emotional toll that cremation takes, simply because in many cases there is then no place for people to go to in order to remember the person who has died. There's no location, and that can be very, very difficult after a death, because we want something physical. We want something physical to do in doing the burial, and we also want a place that we can go to. So there is an emotional toll and a feeling sometimes of incompleteness when there has not been a burial and a place that one can go back to and visit. So I just wanted I'm going to end here by talking about why we want to do this. Why should we be thinking about this and planning for this? And first of all, it's a loving gift to those who remain, a kindness to them, to do this planning ourselves and to not have put that on them, because somebody is going to have to do it. And if we can do it ourselves, then not only do we get to express our wishes, but we, of course, also take that burden off of them. And that is a beautiful thing to be able to do for those we love. Second of all, planning is a gift to ourselves. It helps us come to grips with the fact that our lives will end and that we don't have unlimited time. And as I said at the beginning, that can prompt us to live differently. And that is a gift to us, even though it is a thing we don't like to face and we shouldn't be facing every single day. Just having some time in which we do plan for it, that is a wonderful gift. And lastly, it's again what I referred to at the beginning. Planning is an incentive to live fully. When we contemplate our end, we know that we really have limited time here, and we need to do the things that we know we need to do right now, to take the actions we want to take right now, to reconcile with those whom we have issues with, to forgive others, to apologize to them, to say the words that we need to say, and to open our hearts to loving other people, because our time on this earth is short, and anything we can do to prompt us to live them as fully as possible is a mitzvah, is a really wonderful commandment that honors the gift of life that we've been given. So I'm going to now ask if there are questions, and I think the easiest way to do it is if you raise your hand. Um, I can call on you, and then I'll be able to unmute you. Okay, I see Chuck.
Yes, Rabbi, just to review, it is not necessary to have a lawyer draw up your final wishes, your advance directive. You can do it, you can download a form and get it, do it on your own. So you do not need legal, the costs of it and everything else to do an advance directive.
Thank you. Thank you, Chuck. Barbara. You're still muted because you have muted yourself. I tried to unmute you, but could not. There
Okay. Okay. Hi. This is not theoretical. A parent in another state in a senior home, you know, there are 2 cases of COVID on her hall. It's a Jewish facility and there is a rabbi on site, so that makes things easier. But what do you do in terms of Shiva and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about in our current times.
Yes.
Yeah. So in our current times, we people have been doing Shiva online. We have done that here already at Germantown Jewish Center, and it actually works fairly well, surprisingly, because people are able to gather and support the mourners, and that is what Shiva is all about. So usually, when there's a death in a distant city, people often sit some days in that city and some days back in the community. In this kind of case, depending on the situation, you might be in a situation where you can't go to that place or there's nowhere to go, and then we would have Shiva here and have it online. Yeah, it's still a way to gather. That's what we can do at this time.
Okay, so you still try not to, you want to have the funeral on time, which I think they're still able to do, and then you start Shiva right away.
Yeah, that's right.
That's so weird.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there are sometimes situations, we have had situations recently where the burial actually can't happen right away for various reasons, and in those cases, it depends, but often we start Shiva anyway, because Shiva should not be delayed unduly after the death, because that we know that there's the period in between the death and the burial is a sort of no man's land where the people are in shock and in grief, and yet they're not officially mourners yet, and so we want people to be able to enter into the time to mourn, even if burial has to be delayed.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other hands here. Elaine?
Yes, I actually was already typing you a chat question. I was wondering, don't Jewish cemeteries allow ashes to be buried? Because I know Catholics now permit cremation if the ashes are buried in a Catholic cemetery. Yes.
So the halacha on this, which comes from Maimonides from 1,000 years ago, is that if the body has already been burned or the body has been cremated, what should happen to the remains? They should be buried, and so Jewish cemeteries do allow burial for that.
Okay, I see. Also, you didn't mention anything about mausoleums.
Right. So mausoleums are also, contrary to Jewish tradition. Our tradition requires burial in the earth. Sometime in the last 50 years, people somehow decided that it was a good idea to sell people on the idea of mausoleums for Jews. And so cemeteries created mausoleums, and some people made that choice, but it's not a choice.
I know some people who did that.
Yes.
Now, I had always been told that if it was like a cave, for example, like it was at least partially underground, that was acceptable. But then you see these structures that were obviously built for that purpose.
Right. So these are not caves. And I, like so many things around burial, I never really understand what rabbinic advice that people got that led them to these choices. But it's certainly not something I recommend. And it has no real advantages.
No.
But I have experience with, my grandparents chose that. So that's one of my earliest memories is them being buried in a mausoleum, and it's not one of my favorite memories. We have some hands raised electronically, so I want to get to those people. Let's see. Donald Joseph.
Yes, the question I have is planning one's own funeral. It's my view that the funeral is not for me. It's not my emotions, it's for the mourners. So I have a question about why it should be me and why shouldn't I leave it to them.
Mm. So the traditional view is that the funeral is actually to honor the deceased. So it actually is yours. And that mourning, Shiva, that's about the people left behind. That's for them. But that the funeral really is about the deceased. So again, it can be a gift to them to plan a little bit. That you don't have to tell people what to say. But if you say, this is what I want. I don't want there to be a lot of, I don't want there to be a lot of speakers, for example, or my children don't have to speak, or something like that, to give them a little structure, because people don't have a lot of experience with this, and it can be difficult. So it's not a bad idea to do some planning. Some people do a little, some people do a lot. You certainly have had people who really planned the entire funeral down to exactly who was going to be speaking and the eulogy which they wrote for themselves. So that, and that may be an extreme example, but there's nothing really wrong with that, and it can be helpful to people. Donald, you had something else?
Just want to follow up.
Oh, no.
How do I get people to read what I write?
You can get the rabbi to do it. Rabbis are always willing to do that. Pesha.
So just a couple of things. I'm part of the Reconstructionist Hevra Kadisha, and there is one of the funeral directors at West Laurel Hill is a member of the Hevra. In fact, she became interested in becoming a funeral director from being part of the Hevra. And I know I am not alone in the Hevra, as that being my favorite location to do a Tahara. And it's just they're really set up well, and they have someone they call on to do Shomrim, and I highly recommend that. And the other thing is, my parents were both buried in Florida, but of course they weren't buried, because when you dig down, they're under there, so they are in a mausoleum. Not my favorite.
Right. Yeah. Sheila.
So both of my parents had pre-planned things, and it did help a lot. And there are often unexpected expenses even with that. But as a result of an earlier program we had at GJC, I, as a single person with no family left, went ahead and bought a plot at Montefiore. And once I finished paying that off, I contacted Carl Goldstein at Goldstein's, and now I'm paying off what I've chosen for the funeral. And I know a lot of people think I'm incredibly morose because I've done all this, but I have to tell you, it takes so much stress off of everybody, just like Rabbi has said. And it also allows me to make sure that I can afford what's being done and that it'll be done. And I think it's such a wise thing. Thank you for encouraging everybody to do this. And I've even designed my headstone. So it gives you a tremendous amount of creativity.
Wonderful. Yeah. Ed.
I also, speaking about funeral homes, I had to bury parents, multiple parents, and my feeling about that was that we hadn't pre-planned, and I felt like emotionally we weren't ready to handle what goes on, where they're looking at, well, this one's a beautiful place for your loved one to be, and whatever. And you mentioned having a cardboard box and things like that. So I think that this makes so much more sense. We did, in fact, do what Sheila did, the first part, which was we'll have a Montefiore that's been paid for. Now we will maybe not see Carl Goldstein, but one of the Goldsteins.
And I want to add that even though you called on Ed, that my mother and father, long before they died, but were elderly, sat me down and wanted to talk about all the arrangements and the details. And I have to say, at first, it was very off-putting, and I didn't want to talk about it. But my mother said in a very calm voice, she said, we want to do this while we're still healthy, and our end is not in sight. And that was, in fact, it turned it for me and allowed us to speak to our kids long before your program and the one at GJC. So I encourage everyone who has family to do that.
Wonderful. Hold on one second. I'm just trying to. I'm failing at something technological here. Hold on a second. Can I do it? Nope, I can't. All right. What I was trying to do was to put the link for this the PDFs of these slides in the chat box, but it won't let me copy it right now. So I'll have to send that out, but I will send that out. If anyone has any short question, we could do it, but I really have very little time left here, unfortunately, because I have to go to another thing. Okay, Deborah.
My husband.
I'm Dick Goldberg.
Oh,
and
Dick.
My question is this. Are you aware of any consultants who will lead you through the decision-making process here and help you to make decisions about what it is you want to do in those arrangements? Any professionals who are handling those kinds of issues?
I mean, the funeral directors are very good at doing this. So they are really the people with the most knowledge about it. They walk people through this every day. So they are very compassionate about it, and they're also very knowledgeable about it. So I'd recommend them.
Including all the decisions that lead up to a funeral?
No, in terms of advanced directives, if you email me, I can refer you to somebody. Absolutely. Okay. I unfortunately it's 3:59 and I have to start another program at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to have to stop for now. I really appreciate everybody, and I really want to encourage you, if you do have questions, please email me. I am available for talking about these things, of course, and I would be happy to talk with you about any questions that you may have. So thank you for being part of this, and we'll see you all later.